It was a gray, overcast morning when Ethan Grayson, one of the wealthiest men in New York, sat quietly in the back of his luxury car. The rain streaked down the windows, blurring the bustling streets outside, but his mind was far from the city. He gazed down at the box of toys sitting on the seat beside him. This wasn't just an act of charity, it was an escape from his own grief. For nearly 2 years, Ethan had lived in the shadow of a nightmare. His daughter, Lily, had vanished without a trace on her 8th birthday. The police had done everything they could. Private investigators had scoured every corner of the country, but Lily had disappeared as if she had never existed. It was a pain no amount of wealth could ease, a wound that refused to heal. In the silence of his mansion, surrounded by reminders of her, Ethan had found it unbearable. So, when he heard about the struggling orphanage just outside the city, he impulsively decided to visit, bringing along some toys he had meant to donate for years. Maybe seeing other children smile would dull his agony, even if just for a moment. As the car pulled up to the gates of St. Helena's orphanage, Ethan took a deep breath. The building was old, the red bricks darkened by time and neglect. He hadn't prepared himself for this, but there was no turning back now. His driver opened the door, and Ethan stepped out, the cool breeze brushing against his face, carrying the smell of damp earth and forgotten dreams. Inside the orphanage, the sound of laughter echoed faintly through the narrow halls. The headmistress, Mrs. Carver, greeted him with a warm smile, her eyes betraying the weariness of years spent caring for too many children with too few resources. "Mr. Grayson, we're so grateful for your generosity," she said as they walked toward the common room. "The children don't get new toys often. This will mean the world to them." Ethan nodded absent-mindedly, his eyes scanning the peeling paint on the walls, the worn-out furniture. The building felt heavy with memories, both good and bad. As they entered the large common room, a group of children immediately gathered, eyes wide with excitement at the sight of the brightly colored boxes in Ethan's hands. For the first time in months, he felt a faint smile tug at the corner of his mouth as he watched them swarm around the toys, their faces lighting up with joy. But something, or rather someone, caught his attention. In the far corner of the room, apart from the others, sat a little girl. She was curled up on a tattered armchair, her back to the room, hugging something close to her chest. Her long brown hair fell messily over her face, hiding her expression. Ethan felt an odd pull toward her, a heaviness in his chest that he couldn't explain. "Who's that?" he asked, gesturing toward the girl. Mrs. Carver's smile faltered slightly. "That's Emily. She's shy, doesn't talk much, keeps to herself most days. She's been through a lot." Ethan nodded, but didn't take his eyes off her. There was something familiar about the way she sat, the way her small fingers clutched the stuffed bear she held. Slowly, he made his way toward her, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the thin, faded carpet. As he got closer, his heart skipped a beat. The bear in her arms, it couldn't be. It was old, worn, but unmistakable. The soft, brown fur, the pink ribbon around its neck, the same small tear on its right ear. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was Lily's bear, the one she'd had since she was a baby, the one that had disappeared with her. His voice came out hoarse, almost a whisper. Where did you get that bear?" The girl looked up slowly, her big blue eyes meeting his. They were eyes full of sadness, far too deep for someone so young. She didn't speak, just tightened her grip on the bear, her expression a mixture of fear and confusion. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. It couldn't be a coincidence. There was no way this little girl could have Lily's bear unless... His mind raced with questions, but one thing was clear. He had to know more. He had to find out who this girl was and how she had come to possess the one thing that connected him to his missing daughter. As the realization set in, Ethan felt the room spin around him. He turned to Mrs. Carver, his voice shaky but urgent. "Where did she come from? This girl, Emily, where did she come from?" Mrs. Carver looked taken aback by the sudden intensity in Ethan's voice. Her kind smile disappeared, replaced by concern as she studied his face. It was clear something had shifted in the air, but she didn't yet understand why. "Mr. Grayson, I'm not sure I understand," she said, her voice cautious. Emily's been with us for nearly 2 years now. She came to us under unusual circumstances. Ethan's hands clenched at his sides, his mind racing. 2 years? That was around the time Lily disappeared. His pulse quickened as the pieces of a terrifying puzzle began to form in his head. He had to know more. Unusual circumstances? He pressed, his voice firmer now, trying to keep the edge of panic from slipping through. What do you mean by that? Mrs. Carver glanced down at Emily, who was still clutching the bear tightly, her wide blue eyes darting between the adults. She hesitated before continuing. She was left on our doorstep one night, Mrs. Carver said quietly, as if recalling a memory that had long troubled her. No note, no explanation, just abandoned. We found her shivering in the cold, holding that bear, and she wouldn't let go of it for anything. It's all she had with her. Ethan's throat tightened. His heart pounded as if it was trying to break free from his chest. Every word Mrs. Carver said felt like a punch to his gut. A little girl, dropped off in the dead of night, holding the same bear that had disappeared with his daughter. It couldn't just be coincidence. It had to mean something. How old is she? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper, though it felt like the most important question he had ever asked. 10, Mrs. Carver answered softly, but she doesn't remember much about her life before she came here. At least, she's never spoken about it. We've tried to get her to open up, but she's been through a lot. She's very guarded. Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. Lily would be 10 now. The age, the timing, the bear. It all lined up, but that only raised more questions. If this was Lily's bear, how had it ended up in this girl's arms? And where was Lily? He knelt down slowly, his knees hitting the floor softly in front of Emily, leveling himself to her eye line. He tried to smile, though he could feel the desperation creeping into his expression. His hands trembled slightly as he reached out, but he kept his voice calm. Emily, he said softly, that's a very special bear you've got there. Can you tell me? Where did you get him? The girl didn't answer immediately. She blinked, her grip tightening on the bear as if she feared he might try to take it from her. There was a flicker of fear in her eyes, and Ethan quickly pulled his hands back, not wanting to alarm her. I don't remember, she said after a long pause, her voice barely a whisper. I've always had him. Ethan swallowed hard, his mind swirling with emotion. He could feel the desperation clawing at him, but he couldn't afford to let it show. This little girl who had been through so much, could hold the key to his daughter's whereabouts. But he had to tread carefully. He didn't want to scare her off, didn't want her to retreat further into her shell. That's okay, he said gently. You don't have to remember right now. He glanced back at Mrs. Carver, who was watching the exchange with a growing sense of unease. She could see the intensity in Ethan's eyes, the silent battle he was fighting to keep himself together. Mr. Grayson, is there something you're not telling me? Mrs. Carver asked quietly. You seem very affected by this. Ethan stood up slowly, running a hand through his hair as he struggled to find the right words. He didn't know how to explain it, how to put into words the tidal wave of emotions crashing over him. The last 2 years of sleepless nights, the endless searching, the desperate hope that had never fully died. That bear, he said, his voice trembling slightly, belonged to my daughter, Lily. She disappeared 2 years ago, and she was holding that bear the last time I saw her. Mrs. Carver's eyes widened in shock, her hand flying to her mouth. The room seemed to freeze in that moment, the weight of Ethan's revelation sinking in. Emily's gaze darted between the two adults, her small body tensing as she sensed the growing tension. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew this was only the beginning. If this bear was truly Lily's, then Emily knew something. Maybe not consciously, but somewhere deep inside, she held the answers he'd been searching for. Answers he was now more desperate than ever to find. Please, he said, turning back to Mrs. Carver, his voice barely holding back the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. I need to know everything about her. Everything you can tell me about where she came from, who brought her here. Anything. Mrs. Carver hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do, but the pain in Ethan's eyes was unmistakable. She nodded slowly, realizing that this was bigger than she had ever imagined. "We've kept records," she said softly. "I'll show you what we have. But, Mr. Grayson, I need you to understand. Emily, she's fragile. Whatever you're searching for, please be careful." Ethan nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead. He had to know the truth, no matter what it cost. Ethan's footsteps echoed through the narrow hallway as he followed Mrs. Carver to her office. The distant sound of children laughing in the common room faded into the background, but Ethan couldn't focus on anything except the pounding in his chest. His mind was a storm of questions and fear. If Emily was connected to Lily, then the truth was closer than it had ever been. But what kind of truth would it be? Mrs. Carver opened the door to her cramped, cluttered office. Stacks of paperwork lined her desk, and the faint smell of old books filled the air. She moved quickly, rifling through a drawer until she pulled out a thin manila folder. She handed it to Ethan with a somber look. "This is everything we have on Emily," she said softly. "There isn't much. Just the basics, her medical records, the night she arrived, a few notes from the social worker who processed her intake. But, Mr. Grayson, it's not going to answer all your questions." Ethan took the folder and sat down heavily in the chair across from her desk. His fingers trembled as he opened it. Inside were just a few pages, far too few for the mystery that surrounded the little girl. He skimmed the first page, just general information: her age, estimated at 8 years old when she arrived, her physical condition, which was surprisingly good for a child who had been abandoned. But it was the next page that stopped him cold. His eyes locked on the date she was brought to the orphanage, November 14th. His stomach twisted. That was the exact day Lily had gone missing. 2 years ago, he murmured under his breath, his throat tightening. He tried to steady himself, but it felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Mrs. Carver noticed his reaction. "What is it?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "That date," Ethan replied, his voice cracking. "It's the same day my daughter disappeared. How is that possible?" The room seemed to grow colder, and Mrs. Carver's face paled. She leaned back in her chair, her brow furrowed deeply. I don't know," she said slowly, her voice filled with uncertainty. "Like I said, Emily was left at our doorstep that night. No one saw who brought her. We assumed it was a parent in a desperate situation." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He had always believed that someone had taken Lily, but this was beyond what he could have imagined. It was too close, too many coincidences for it not to mean something. He turned the page, and there, written in neat, clinical handwriting, was the social worker's report. The words blurred as he read them, his mind struggling to make sense of it all. Child was found outside the orphanage at 9:45 p.m. No injuries, no signs of neglect. The only item in her possession was a stuffed bear. That bear, the same one Lily had clutched in her small hands the day she vanished. Ethan's hands balled into fists as a wave of emotions surged through him. Grief, anger, hope, all colliding inside him. "Is there anything else?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Did anyone see a car? A person? Anything?" Mrs. Carver shook her head. "No. We contacted the police, but with no information to go on, they couldn't do much. Emily was too young to tell us where she came from. She was scared, confused. After a while, she stopped talking about it altogether." Ethan's mind raced. Someone had dropped Emily off, and whoever it was could be connected to his daughter. But how? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Both Ethan and Mrs. Carver turned as the door creaked open, revealing one of the older girls from the orphanage. "Excuse me, Mrs. Carver," she said timidly. "Emily's been asking for you." Mrs. Carver nodded and gave Ethan a quick, apologetic glance. "I'll be right there," she said, then turned back to Ethan. "I think we've gone over everything, Mr. Grayson, but if you have more questions, I'll do my best to help." Ethan stood up, his hands still clutching the file. His mind was buzzing with unanswered questions, but there was one thing he needed to do before he left. He needed to talk to Emily again, alone. There was something about the way she held that bear, the way she looked at him. It wasn't just a child's attachment to a toy. There was a connection there. He could feel it in his bones. "Can I speak to her again?" Ethan asked quietly. Just me and her. Mrs. Carver hesitated, clearly unsure. Mr. Grayson, she's very delicate. I'll be gentle, I promise, Ethan interrupted, his tone urgent but calm. Please, I just need a few minutes. After a long pause, Mrs. Carver relented. All right, she said softly, but I'll be nearby if you need me. Ethan nodded, grateful. Together, they walked back to the common room, where the children were still playing. But Emily wasn't among them. She had retreated to her quiet corner again, sitting on the same tattered armchair, the bear still nestled in her arms. Ethan approached slowly, his heart racing. He knelt down in front of her again, the same way he had before, trying to keep his voice soft and steady. Emily, he said gently, I need to ask you something important. The little girl's eyes flicked up to meet his, but she said nothing. That bear, Ethan continued, pointing to the toy in her lap. Do you remember who gave it to you? Was it someone you knew? Emily's small hands tightened around the bear, her lips trembling slightly. For a moment, Ethan thought she wouldn't answer. But then, in a voice so quiet he could barely hear her, she whispered, a lady. Ethan's breath caught. A lady? He repeated, his heart pounding. Can you remember anything else about her? Emily hesitated, her brow furrowing as she tried to recall something distant, something buried deep in her memory. She was scared, she whispered finally. She told me not to tell. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. His heart raced as he processed her words. Whoever this lady was, she was scared. And she had told Emily not to tell anyone. That could only mean one thing. Someone had been hiding the truth. Not to tell what, Emily? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What didn't she want you to tell? Emily shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I don't remember, she whispered. I don't remember anything. Ethan's stomach dropped. He could see the fear in her eyes, the confusion, and he knew that whatever had happened, it had left a deep scar on her fragile memory. But one thing was clear. There was more to this story than he had realized, and he wasn't going to stop until he uncovered every last piece of it. Ethan left the orphanage with his mind spinning, every step feeling heavier than the last. Emily's words replayed over and over in his head. A lady? She was scared. Not to tell. Someone knew the truth about what happened to his daughter, and they had hidden it. Whoever this woman was, she held the answers he'd been searching for, and he was more determined than ever to find her. Back in his car, Ethan pulled out his phone, his hands trembling slightly as he dialed the number of his private investigator, Jack Mercer. Jack had been with Ethan from the very beginning, relentlessly pursuing leads when everyone else had given up. If anyone could help him dig into Emily's past, it was Jack. The line clicked, and Jack's familiar, gruff voice came through. Grayson? It's been a while. What's going on? Ethan didn't waste any time. I need you to run a background check on a little girl named Emily, he said, his voice tense. She's in St. Helena's orphanage, and there's something connected to Lily. I don't know what it is yet, but I need you to look into it. There's a woman who dropped her off 2 years ago, but there's no information on her. Can you find out who she is? There was a pause on the other end of the line before Jack responded, his voice cautious. You think this girl's connected to Lily? Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know for sure, Jack, but she has Lily's teddy bear. She arrived at the orphanage the same night Lily disappeared. There's no way that's a coincidence. Jack was silent for a moment, processing the information. All right, he said finally, his voice firm. I'll dig into it, see if I can track down any leads on this woman or where Emily came from. But Ethan, don't get your hopes up too high, okay? We've been down this road before. Ethan clenched his jaw. He knew Jack was right. They'd followed countless dead ends over the years, leads that seemed promising but ended in heartbreak. But this felt different. It felt real. I hear you, Ethan said, though his voice betrayed the faint hope that still flickered inside him. But do what you can. I need to know. After hanging up, Ethan sat in the silence of the car, staring out at the rain-soaked streets of the city. His mind wandered back to the moment he'd seen Emily clutching that bear, how his heart had stopped when he realized what it was. It had to mean something. He wasn't ready to let go of that hope. Not yet. The days that followed were agonizingly slow. Ethan threw himself into work, trying to distract himself from the growing tension in his chest. But every time his phone buzzed, his heart leapt, hoping it was Jack with news. He barely slept, haunted by dreams of Lily, of that last day with her, of the way her laugh used to fill their home. Then, finally, 3 days after he had spoken to Jack, his phone rang. Ethan grabbed it off his desk so quickly he nearly knocked over his coffee. "Jack?" Ethan answered, his voice thick with anticipation. "I've got something," Jack said, his tone serious. "It's not much, but it's a start. I found some security footage from the street near the orphanage from the night Emily was dropped off. It's blurry, but you can make out a car, an old sedan. I traced the plates. It was registered to a woman named Sarah Green. She used to live in a small town a couple hours outside the city. But here's the thing. She vanished about a year after Emily was left at the orphanage. No trace of her since." Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. "Vanished? Just like that?" "Yeah," Jack confirmed. "No missing person report was filed. It's like she just disappeared. But I did some digging. She had no family, no job history that really stands out. The only connection she had was to a man, her landlord, a guy named Vincent Rhodes. Apparently, she was behind on rent, struggling to get by. I'm going to head up there, see if I can find out more about her. I'll let you know what I find." Ethan nodded, though the weight of it all settled in his chest. The more he learned, the more questions seemed to surface. Why had Sarah Green dropped Emily off? Why had she disappeared? And how did all of this tie back to Lily? "Thanks, Jack," Ethan said quietly, hanging up the phone. His mind raced with possibilities. He knew he couldn't just sit and wait. He had to take matters into his own hands. If Sarah had vanished, maybe there was someone else who knew her. Someone who could fill in the blanks. Without hesitating, Ethan grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. He needed to go to the source, to the town where Sarah Green had lived, where maybe, just maybe, someone could tell him what had happened that night 2 years ago. The drive felt longer than it was, the small town of Riverdale creeping into view as Ethan's car wound its way through narrow roads lined with weathered houses and quiet streets. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were whispered behind closed doors. Ethan parked outside a rundown building that passed for an apartment complex. The paint was peeling, and the windows were dirty, but it was the last known address Jack had given him for Sarah Green. He knocked on the landlord's door, and after a long moment, it opened. A tall, burly man with a gruff expression stepped out. "What do you want?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he looked Ethan up and down. "I'm looking for Sarah Green," Ethan said, his voice steady. "She used to live here. I was told you might know something about her." The man, Vincent Rhodes, snorted, crossing his arms over his chest. "Sarah? Yeah, I remember her. Lived here for a couple years, always behind on rent. Then one day, she just up and left. Haven't seen her since." Ethan frowned, sensing there was more to the story. "Do you know where she went? Did she say anything before she left?" Vincent shrugged, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Something he wasn't saying. "Not really. Look, she wasn't the type to have a lot of friends. Kept to herself mostly. But I'll tell you this, she was scared. Always looking over her shoulder, like she thought someone was after her. Don't know what her deal was, but she was running from something." Ethan's heart raced. Running from something. It was exactly what he'd feared, and exactly what he needed to hear. "Do you have any idea who she was afraid of?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice calm, though inside, everything was spiraling out of control. Vincent hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "Nah, man. All I know is she left in a hurry. Didn't take much with her. I haven't thought about her since." Ethan thanked him and turned to leave, frustration building inside him. He'd come all this way, and still, the answers were just out of reach. But as he reached for his car door, something caught his eye, a small, weathered journal peeking out from the cracked seat of an old chair in the hallway. It was covered in dust, but when Ethan opened it, the pages inside were filled with messy handwriting. The first page was signed, Sarah Green. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the journal in his hands. It was old, the cover worn and brittle, but it was unmistakably Sarah Green's. His pulse quickened as he flipped through the first few pages, skimming over scribbled notes and chaotic handwriting. Most of it was disjointed thoughts, fragments of a life lived in fear. But there was something deeper buried within these pages. Something he hoped would lead him closer to the truth about his daughter. He sat back in his car, the worn leather seat creaking beneath him as he read. The first few entries seemed ordinary enough. Sarah writing about her struggles to pay rent, how lonely she felt. But then, as he got further into the journal, the tone shifted. The writing became more frantic, more erratic. She mentioned being watched, feeling unsafe, like someone was constantly following her. Ethan's hands tightened around the journal as he read a passage that sent chills down his spine. They found me again. I thought I could hide her, but they know. They always know. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. She's starting to ask questions. I can't let them take her. She's safer without me. His breath caught in his throat. She was talking about Emily. She had to be. The words felt like a punch to his gut. Someone had been after Sarah, and she had been trying to protect the girl. But who were they? And why had Sarah been so scared that she abandoned Emily at the orphanage? Flipping through more pages, Ethan's eyes landed on another entry, dated just a few days before Sarah disappeared. I can't run forever. I don't know what to do anymore. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. If they find out what I did, I don't know what they'll do to her. I have to make sure they never find out. Ethan's hands trembled as the gravity of her words settled in. Sarah had been hiding something. Something she believed would put Emily, and maybe even herself, in danger. But what was it? And why had she felt the need to run? His phone buzzed in his pocket, jerking him out of his thoughts. He fumbled for it, his mind still reeling as he saw Jack's name flash across the screen. Jack? Ethan answered, his voice tight with anticipation. I've got more, Jack said, his voice serious. It took some digging, but I found out why Sarah was running. She wasn't just some scared woman trying to hide from her problems. She was involved with a group, people with dangerous connections. There's a criminal network, small time but brutal. I don't have all the details yet, but they deal in some pretty dark stuff. Drugs, trafficking, you name it. Sarah got mixed up with them a few years before she disappeared. That's why she was running. She knew too much. Ethan's stomach turned. He had expected something bad, but not this. Not a connection to something so dangerous. And Emily? Where does she fit into all of this? He asked, gripping the steering wheel as though it would steady him. That's the thing, Jack said, his voice lowering. I think Emily's not just some random girl Sarah found. There's a reason she was so protective. I found an old police report. Sarah was questioned years ago in relation to a missing child case. A case that was never solved. Ethan? It was around the time Lily disappeared. Ethan's blood ran cold. What are you saying? Jack hesitated for a beat before answering, his voice tense. I'm saying I think Sarah knew more about Lily's disappearance than we realized. And she was running because she didn't want anyone to find out. It's possible, hell, it's likely, she was involved. The words hung in the air, suffocating. Ethan's grip tightened around the journal, his knuckles white. Could it really be true? Could Sarah have been involved in Lily's disappearance this entire time? His thoughts spun out of control, memories of his little girl flooding back to him. Her bright smile, her infectious laugh, the way she'd cling to his hand when she was scared. The pain of losing her was like a raw wound that had never fully healed, and now, to think that this woman, Sarah Green, might have taken her. Ethan's hands shook as he closed the journal and shoved it into his bag. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to confront Emily. He had to know if she remembered more than she was letting on. If Sarah had been involved in Lily's disappearance, then Emily might be the key to finding out what happened that night. The drive back to St. Helena's orphanage felt like a blur. His thoughts raced, each one more frantic than the last. By the time he pulled up in front of the building, his nerves were frayed, his chest tight with a mixture of hope and dread. He knew that whatever happened next could change everything. Inside, the orphanage was quiet. Most of the children were in their rooms, settling in for the night. Ethan made his way to Mrs. Carver's office, his footsteps quick and determined. When he found her, she looked up in surprise. Mr. Grayson, she said, standing from her desk. "I wasn't expecting you back so soon." "I need to see Emily," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Now." Mrs. Carver's expression shifted, concern flickering in her eyes. "Is everything all right? What's going on?" "I'll explain everything later," Ethan said, barely able to contain the urgency in his voice. "But I need to talk to her. It's important." Mrs. Carver studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "She's in her room. Follow me." They made their way down the hallway, the soft hum of the building the only sound between them. When they reached Emily's door, Mrs. Carver knocked softly. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and Emily stood there, her wide eyes staring up at them. "Emily, Mr. Grayson needs to speak with you," Mrs. Carver said gently, giving her a reassuring smile before stepping aside. Ethan crouched down to Emily's level, his heart pounding in his chest. "Emily, I need to ask you something very important," he said, his voice as calm as he could manage. "It's about Sarah, the woman who brought you to the orphanage." Emily's eyes flickered with fear at the mention of Sarah's name, and she clutched her teddy bear tighter, as if it were a shield protecting her from the world. Ethan's heart ached at the sight of her, this little girl who had been through so much, now trapped in a world of secrets and fear. "Do you remember anything else about her?" Ethan asked softly. "Anything she said before she left you here?" For a long moment, Emily didn't answer. She stared at the floor, her fingers twisting the worn fabric of the bear's fur. Then, in a voice so quiet it was barely a whisper, she said, "She told me to forget." Ethan's breath hitched. "Forget what?" Emily shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Everything. She said it was safer if I didn't remember." Ethan's chest tightened. He reached out, gently placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "It's okay, Emily. You can tell me. You're safe now." Emily looked up at him, her blue eyes filled with a sadness far too deep for someone so young. "She told me she was sorry. She said she didn't mean to take me." Ethan's world stopped. The words hit him like a freight train, the weight of them crushing him. His mind reeled, struggling to process what Emily had just said. She didn't mean to take me. Sarah hadn't just been running from something. She had been running because she had taken Emily. And if Sarah had taken Emily, then she might have taken Lily too. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the pieces finally started to fall into place. Ethan's world felt like it had been ripped apart, the air thick with disbelief. The words, "She didn't mean to take me," echoed in his mind, over and over. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow. He stared at Emily, his mind racing with 1,000 questions, but his voice was stuck in his throat. Could it be possible? Had Sarah, this woman who had fled in fear, taken not just Emily, but Lily too? Emily was still looking at him, her eyes wide and frightened, clutching her teddy bear like it was the only thing grounding her in this terrifying moment. Ethan struggled to hold himself together, knowing that whatever he said next could shatter the fragile trust she had placed in him. He swallowed hard, his voice shaky but gentle. "Emily, do you remember anything else? Anything about that night? Did Sarah say why she took you?" The little girl hesitated, biting her lip as she glanced down at the bear in her arms. She hugged it tighter, her small frame trembling. For a long, agonizing moment, Ethan thought she might shut down completely. But then, in a voice so small it was almost a whisper, she began to speak. "She was crying," Emily said, her words barely audible. "She told me she was sorry. She said she made a mistake, that she wasn't supposed to take me." Her voice wavered, her eyes filling with tears. "But she said it was too late to go back. She said someone would find out, and that I had to forget, that I was safer here." Ethan felt the room tilt around him, the walls closing in. It wasn't just a mistake. Sarah had been involved in something far more sinister. But why? Why would she take Emily? And why would she leave her at an orphanage, only to disappear? Ethan's hands trembled as he reached for his phone, dialing Jack's number with shaking fingers. His heart raced as the call connected, his voice tight with urgency. "Jack," he breathed, "I need you to find out everything you can about Sarah Green. Dig deeper into her connections, who she worked with, who she was running from. I think she took Emily." And if she took Emily, she might have taken Lily too. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the weight of Ethan's words sinking in. "Jesus, Grayson," Jack muttered, his voice grim. "Are you sure?" "I'm not sure of anything anymore," Ethan admitted, his voice breaking. "But I can't ignore the signs. Everything points to her. I need answers, Jack. I need to know what happened to my daughter." "I'll get on it," Jack said firmly. "I'll call you as soon as I have something." Ethan hung up the phone and leaned back in the chair, his head spinning. The room felt too small, too suffocating. He wanted to scream, to punch something, to make the pieces of this nightmare fall into place. But all he could do was sit there, helpless, as the weight of it all crushed him. Mrs. Carver, who had been watching the conversation from the doorway, stepped forward, her face filled with sympathy. "Mr. Grayson, I can't imagine what you're going through, but please know we'll do everything we can to help you. Emily is safe here." Ethan nodded absently, barely hearing her. He felt numb, his mind caught in a loop of disbelief and agony. His daughter was out there. He could feel it in his bones. But the path to finding her was darker and more twisted than he had ever imagined. That night, Ethan barely slept. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Lily, of Emily, of Sarah Green. He lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, his heart heavy with grief and guilt. He had failed his daughter. He had failed to protect her. And now, the only lead he had was a fragile little girl with memories too painful to unlock. By morning, his phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting him awake. He grabbed it, his heart skipping a beat as Jack's name flashed across the screen. "Jack?" Ethan answered, his voice raw with anticipation. "I found something," Jack said, his tone grave. "It's worse than we thought. Sarah Green wasn't just running from some random criminal group. She was involved in a child trafficking ring, a small, underground operation that's been flying under the radar for years. They specialize in kidnapping children, then selling them off to the highest bidder. Sarah was a courier, but it looks like she got in too deep. She tried to get out, but they wouldn't let her." Ethan's blood ran cold. The word trafficking slammed into him like a freight train, and his stomach turned. His hands tightened around the phone, his knuckles white. "And Lily?" Ethan asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Was she taken?" Jack hesitated, and that silence told Ethan everything he needed to know. "I think so, Ethan," Jack said finally. "I think Sarah was supposed to deliver Emily to them, but she couldn't go through with it. She dropped her at the orphanage instead. But Lily, I don't know. She might still be out there. Somewhere." Ethan felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. His little girl, his Lily, had been taken by monsters, people who had no regard for the lives they destroyed. And Sarah Green had been part of it. "How do we find her?" Ethan asked, his voice breaking. "How do I get my daughter back?" "I'm working on it," Jack said. "I've got contacts looking into the group's operations. It's not going to be easy, but I'll do everything I can to track them down." Ethan nodded, though the weight of Jack's words pressed down on him. Every minute that passed felt like a lifetime. Every second that ticked by another reminder that his daughter was out there, somewhere, waiting for him to find her. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan's life became a blur of phone calls, meetings with Jack, and sleepless nights. The investigation into Sarah Green's involvement with the trafficking ring uncovered a dark and twisted web of lies. But every lead they followed seemed to slip through their fingers. It was like trying to catch smoke. No matter how close they got, the truth always seemed just out of reach. But then, one evening, as Ethan sat in his office staring blankly at his phone, waiting for a call that felt like it would never come, Jack's number lit up the screen. Ethan grabbed the phone, his heart pounding. "Jack?" "I've got her," Jack said, his voice filled with urgency. "Lily. I found her." Ethan's breath hitched, his heart racing. Where is she?" "There's a compound," Jack explained, his voice quick and direct. "About an hour outside the city. It's run by the group Sarah was involved with. They've been using it to hold children before moving them. But I don't know how much time we have. They're planning to move the kids tonight." Ethan shot to his feet, his mind racing. "I'm coming with you." "Ethan, no." Jack started to protest, but Ethan cut him off. She's my daughter, Jack. I'm not sitting this one out. Jack sighed on the other end of the line, then relented. Fine, but we need to move fast. The drive to the compound was a blur, Ethan's heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. The thought of seeing Lily again, of holding her in his arms, was the only thing keeping him from breaking down completely. Jack drove in silence, his face set in grim determination, while Ethan stared out the window, his mind swirling with the memories of the daughter he had lost. When they arrived at the compound, it was dark and quiet, the only sound the rustling of the wind through the trees. Jack led the way, moving quickly but cautiously, and Ethan followed, his heart in his throat. The compound was heavily guarded, but Jack had come prepared. With a few quick moves, he disabled the security cameras and led Ethan through a side entrance, their footsteps quiet as they moved through the dimly lit corridors. And then, as they rounded a corner, Ethan saw her. Lily. She was sitting in a small room, her knees pulled up to her chest, her face pale and thin. She looked older than Ethan remembered, but it was her, his little girl. Lily, Ethan whispered, his voice breaking as he rushed forward, falling to his knees in front of her. Her eyes widened as she looked up, recognition slowly dawning in her gaze. Daddy, she whispered, her voice small and fragile. Ethan pulled her into his arms, tears streaming down his face as he held her close, the weight of 2 years of agony and grief finally breaking free. It's okay, Ethan whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I've got you. You're safe now. I'm never letting you go again. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ethan allowed himself to hope again. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story about overcoming challenges and family love, don't forget to like the video, comment on what touched you the most, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for our next exciting story.